trying to do some integration in that.
All right, we're going to get started. It's 12:30. Okay, so welcome to the Duke Journal of Gender Law and Policy's annual symposium. This is our third event this week. Our focus is on intersectionality and Black Lives Matter. Our first day was on Black women and girls in the Black Lives Matter movement. Second day was Black Lives Matter in prison, and we focus on the impacts of prison after Black people are released from prison. Tomorrow is Black LGBTQI Lives Matter, so we'll be focusing on LGBTQI people's place in the movement. But today we are talking about Black lives in school, and we'll be talking about segregation in the school to prison pipeline. I always forget to introduce myself. My name is Glenda DeVille, and I'm the special projects editor for the journal. Okay, so before we get into introducing the moderator and the panelists and get to talking and doing the fun stuff, I'll just explain the structure for people who, this is their first event for the week. So first, we'll have our moderator ask the panelists a series of questions. They'll answer it, get into fun discussion amongst themselves, and then later we'll open it up to the audience to ask questions to the panelists, to each other. This is meant to be a discussion, not just like a lecture. So start thinking of questions you want to ask now. The first part, the panel, will be recorded, and you can find that later and share it with your friends. But the second part, the question session, won't be recorded. So please feel comfortable asking whatever you want. It won't follow you, I guess, on the internet or whatever. So just answer ask great questions. Okay, so I'll start by introducing the panel. So we have our moderator for today, Professor Jane Weddick. Jane Weddick directs the Children's Law Clinic and teaches education law at the law school. She joined the law school faculty in 1994 after practicing poverty law for 13 years with legal aid offices in Raleigh and Winston-Salem, North Carolina, developing particular expertise in the law of government benefits. She has argued cases in the U.S. Supreme Court and the North Carolina Supreme Court, as well as other public courts. Prior to establishing the Children's Law Clinic in 2002, she served as supervising attorney in Duke's AIDS legal project and as an instructor in legal writing. Our first panelist for today is Ms. Dorothy Counts-Scoggins. Ms. Counts-Scoggins was one of the first Black students to attend the all-white high school, Hardin High in Charlotte. She experienced a series of abuse during her time at Hardin High, but the school named their library after her, which is an incredibly rare honor, given the school's board policy generally of not naming buildings after people, which is interesting. She has worked primarily with children for 12 years, heading up a church-based child care center that served low-income kids, and for the last 22 years at the local nonprofit child care resources, advocating for better child care. Our second panelist is Mr. Maurice Green. Maurice Green is the executive director of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. He is also co-lead for the Strengthening Democracy portfolio. Mr. Green joined the foundation in March 2016 after completing more than 7 years as superintendent of Guilford County Schools, the third largest school district in North Carolina, where he oversaw more than 72,000 students, 127 schools, approximately 10,000 employees, and a budget of more than $600 million. Before Guilford County Schools, Mr. Green joined Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools in 2001 as general counsel. In 2006, he was named chief operating officer and later moved into the role of deputy superintendent. And best of all, he graduated from Duke Law School. And our last, but certainly not least, panelist is Ricky Watson Jr. Mr. Watson is co-director of the Youth Justice Project at the Southern Justice Coalition. What?
Southern Coalition for Social Justice.
Southern Coalition for Social Justice, thank you.
It's a mouthful.
Yes, which works to ensure equity, fairness, and justice for youth in education, juvenile delinquency, and criminal systems. During law school, Mr. Watson taught legal principles to middle school students and also worked in the court system as a prosecutor. After law school, he worked as an assistant public defender in Guilford County, focusing primarily on juvenile delinquency matters as well as civil and involuntary commitment proceedings. So please help me with welcoming the
Well, thanks for all of you being here, and let me add my welcome to you and to the panelists. We're really lucky to have the three of you here with us and to sort of talk about the intersectionality of education and the Black Lives Matter movement. And, you know, I think all of us know that when we're in school, that's where one of the most profound places where we start getting messages about our lives and where we fit in and whether our life matters and how it matters to other people. And children in school start figuring out, well, where do I fit into this society? And for Black children in America today in our public schools, many of them start to experience some negative messages. And they hear about this thing called the achievement gap, where statistics are published that seem to prove that they're not as academically successful. All they really say is on a particular standardized tests as an aggregate matter, there is a gap between the scores of white students and the scores of Black students, and we've named that the achievement gap. Something we want to talk about here today and what that means and what are those messages. And we have still a lot of racial segregation in our public schools around America. Despite our Supreme Court case that you all know about of 60 years ago, that did not end segregation in America. It might have ended statutes that demanded it, but it certainly didn't end it in terms of what's happening in our schools and what's on the ground, so that many Black students, especially low-income Black students, look around and they only see other Black low-income students in their schools, and they are not and nor are white students in integrated situations that would perhaps deliver better messages about people's lives. And finally, we want to talk a little bit about this narrative of what we call the school-to-prison pipeline. And again, statistics are showing that African Americans suffer harsh discipline in school about 4 times as often as white students do. Lots of times, simply adolescent misbehavior is characterized as criminal behavior, and sets these children off onto a negative trajectory as a result of that. So our panelists have a lot of experience with all of these topics, and I'm looking forward to having them share their thoughts and experiences on them. So we would want to start with each of them sort of describing their work and now and in the past. We've heard a little bit about each of you and how you see what you've done sort of fits into the Black Lives Matter movement, especially as it relates to education. And maybe we can start with you, Ms. Counts-Scoggins.
Thank you. I retired in 2012, and as Glenda shared with you, that I had worked in the early childhood field for the last 40 years. And one of the reasons why I chose that career, because I felt that it starts at birth with children in terms of understanding who they are, but at the same time, they're not born with prejudice. This is learned. So I thought that if I could start working not only with families and children and teachers to make sure that they understand the importance of acceptance. So in 2012, when I retired, I decided I was going to take another journey. And because education is a passion for me, I chose to go into the schools, Charlotte Mecklenburg schools, and do some mentoring in the schools, but also work in some of the schools that are in the area in which I live. I live in an area that is going through transformation at this time, but what happens is the schools in that area are predominantly children of color. But not only are they children of color, they're also schools that are some of the low-performing schools in Charlotte. So that has been my active engagement since 2012. I was at a meeting last night at one of the elementary schools trying to talk to parents in terms of what kind of choices they need to make and what route we need to take, because they're in a school that's over 60 years old, and it's a K-8 school, and it's not suited for middle school children.
Mr. Green.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. Hold on. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
All right. Wonderful to see everyone this afternoon. And I must tell you, I know there was a great introduction for Ms. Counts-Scoggins, but I have to tell you that I had the opportunity to work in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools and learned a lot about this woman. And you happen to be in a room with a living legend. Someone who helped to desegregate Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools way back when, and I think we were able to honor you by having you come to a graduation at Harding High School while I was still there. So it's my pleasure to be with you in particular this afternoon. A couple things about me, and perhaps I should say about the organizations that I work with. The current one was mentioned as the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. It's an 80-year-old foundation based in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. It has in its organizing documents that it will do charitable works for the state of North Carolina. So a box around one state, but charitable works can mean lots of things and has over its 80-year existence. We are currently focused in 5 focus areas. To include certainly community economic development, democracy, public education, the environment, and then social justice and equity work. So this is a foundation that puts at its forefront significant focus on issues of equity, racial equity, both across those focus areas to include public education. We try to do a multitude of different things in supporting organizations that will bring forth those issues. We, as an example, just last fall took a group of over 50 people and sponsored them to go to a conference in Atlanta around racial justice issues. We make as a key part of making a grant, asking questions of diversity of boards, diversity of staff. Would you be interested in going through racial equity trainings, because we believe that it's important to put those issues right out at the forefront. And then certainly in my work prior to being at Z. Smith Reynolds, because I've only been there for less than a year, I was the superintendent of Guilford County Schools, as was mentioned, and was led actually by one of our board members, Dina Hayes, who works with the Racial Equity Institute, and really sort of saying that we've got to put race at the forefront of our conversations in Guilford County schools. And we've got to have honest, crucial conversations about that. We've got to educate ourselves about those issues, and so we really tried to go as deep as we could in a multitude of different ways with leadership at the schoolhouse, trying to be sure that we lifted up those issues, because as it turns out, if you control for pretty much everything in Guilford County schools and in school districts all across this country, the issue that always bubbles up as to where students are either at the bottom where they should be at the top or at the top where they should be at the bottom, it would be race. And unfortunately, it would be students of color that will find themselves at the bottom of things like academic outcomes, or at the top, things like out-of-school suspensions. And so what are we going to do about that? Doing something that tries to certainly address all students is important, but then I think you have to pay attention to those subgroups of students and focus on what you can do to achieve results with them as well. Be happy to talk about that more as we go forward.
Thank you. Mr. Watson.
How are you guys doing? My name's Ricky Watson. I'm one of the co-directors of the Youth Justice Project at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, and yes, that is a mouthful. So essentially, SCSJ is a civil rights firm. We have several attorneys who deal and practice in criminal justice, clean slate clinics and expunctions to try to help repair people's criminal records. We have a voting rights section that's very active and doing a lot of litigation right now. And then we have Youth Justice Project, which is what I'm one of the co-directors of. Our work is varied, but generally we work to improve outcomes of both youth in both educational and criminal systems. My day can vary from drafting an amicus brief to support litigation as to why Halifax County should merge all 3 of their school systems in a small county like Halifax that's completely segregated, splits resources 3 different ways, to going out into the community and helping organize and strategize the best ways to implement change and promote different policies to be implemented throughout a school system. We have 3 major focus groups. One of them is school, community, and court partnerships. We do a great deal of work in misdemeanor diversion programs and trying to help support the expansion of misdemeanor diversion programs across the state, because North Carolina is basically the last state, with the exception of New York, to automatically treat 16 and 17-year-olds as adults in the criminal justice system. We also work to revise school policies to promote alternatives to suspensions and court involvement. We also do a great deal of policy and legislative work around raising the age specifically right now. That's a big focus for us. We also do a lot of community outreach and action. One big piece that I'd like to, impress upon you guys is that we worked on racial equity report cards, and those kind of break down throughout the state a lot of the data that's really hard to kind of piece apart for the average person. It's kind of scattered across the state, but essentially what we did was compiled racial equity report cards that kind of show exactly how kids are doing in every school system in North Carolina. I'd encourage you to check those out.
Thanks to all of you. Well, let's start with this topic of segregation. So, 60 years ago, and Ms. Counts-Scoggins was right at the center of it when we had legally imposed segregation, and then we had our Supreme Court case that said it was no longer lawful, and the process was begun to integrate our schools. And maybe you could talk a little bit about your personal experience, and then what you see today as maybe different from what you and your family thought you might see when you read Brown v. Board when you were a school child at that time. And then as the panelists, we can talk a little bit more about segregation now.
As was stated earlier, in 1957, I was one of 4 African-American children in Charlotte, North Carolina, to attempt to integrate the schools. This was 3 years after Brown. Nothing in Charlotte was being done at that time. There were several activists in Charlotte. Most of them were civil rights attorneys who said it's time to change the system, and so we're going to challenge them and see what will happen. 20 families applied, but only 4 families were accepted, and of course my family was one of those. The first day at Harding was not a good experience for me. I had no idea when my father drove up to the school that I was going to be surrounded by possibly 250 to 300 people. Most of them were students, but they also were adults as well. As I got out of the car, because they would not let my father drive down to the entrance to the school, I had to walk about 2 blocks. So during that walk to the entrance of the auditorium, this is when the harassment started. I was pushed, I was shoved, things were thrown at me such as rocks and milk cartons and ice. But one of the things that was probably the most humiliating thing for me is the girls were told to spit on her. So as I walked that 2 blocks to the auditorium, by the time I reached the auditorium, of course, spit was dripping from the bottom of my dress. When I walked into the auditorium, it was a little calmer, but I ended up sitting by myself and was not acknowledged that I was there until they said that all of the students that were supposed to be in my class, we were to proceed to our homeroom. Same kind of treatment happened, ignored by teachers, ignored by administration. And so at the end of the day, when I went home, my parents asked me, what did I think? And I told them that, yes, I did want to go back. One of the reasons why, I guess I carry my father's genes, but at the same time, I am a very determined person. So when I did go back, I missed one day because I woke up the next morning and wasn't feeling well. But when I went back on Monday, naturally there were no crowds because they said, well, we've gotten rid of her. When I walked into the building, they were surprised. And the same kinds of things began to happen in the building. And this went on for several days. But the thing that really, I guess, brought fear to me was the last day that I was there. I had asked my parents if I could come home at lunchtime because the day before I was surrounded at the table in the cafeteria and they spat in my food. And I said to my parents, at least I need to eat, so can somebody come and pick me up and bring me home for lunch? So when I walked to my locker to get my things out of my locker, I was hit in the back of my head with a sharp object and the back of my back with a blackboard eraser. But that wasn't as bad as when I got to the door to go outside. My parents' car, the back window of the car was shattered in a million pieces. And my brother was sitting inside. And I said to myself, for me, that's one thing, but to be able to do this and have my family involved in this, that I'm not so sure that this is the right time for me. So when I got home and shared that with my parents, of course, my parents agreed with me after calling the police and as well as calling the superintendent, and both of them said that they could not guarantee my safety. So the decision was made then that I would leave Harding. One of the things that happened, what that experience did for me, is I chose at that time at 15 years old that what happened to me was not going to happen to another child. So that sort of actually put me on the path in terms of the kinds of things that I have done in my life. And I started out in social work. I was a teacher, but as I said to you earlier, that I ended up working with early childhood and with young children, because what I said is if I can teach them at an early age acceptance, then possibly this would be a better world for all of us to live in.
Well, thanks. That's a powerful story. Mr. Green, I mean, where have we come since that day in our schools? You were the superintendent of the schools, and where was Greensboro on integration, and where is it now, and what's been the history since then?
So I would say the history has been similar in Greensboro, Guilford County, as it has been in many districts across this country, and certainly across this state, that after the True Heroes started the process, there was this period where it was actually increased numbers of students. Actually, there were lots of efforts put together to desegregate the schools. And you could look across this country and really see that that really did occur. Certainly it was happening in Guilford County in a similar vein that it happened in Mecklenburg County. But then, that if you could sort of say that there was a period of time in the 90s, well, even before then, it was starting to creep back away from those efforts. But then in the 90s and certainly thereafter, you're seeing schools become more and more segregated. And so in Guilford County schools, as an example, the schools are, they're sort of various schools, but there are a number of schools that are very segregated, both by race and by levels of socioeconomic status. So we look at that through free reduced lunch meals, or free and reduced lunch, breakfast and lunch. And so it has happened pretty dramatically in Guilford County, where you will see many schools that have 90+% of the students in that school who are students of color, non-white, if you will, and are also eligible for free and reduced lunch. And so I think we have gone back to, in many ways, to where we were back in the 50s and 60s, quite honestly. The result of that, and so there are other things now in play, particularly in North Carolina, because it's probably context setting is important in this regard. So, in the 50s and the 60s, through all the strife and difficulties that occurred, and then certainly into the 70s, where Swan, y'all, if you haven't studied it, we'll be studying the Swan case, which is the busing case that comes out of Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. Certainly the context that is important is there certainly were a number of folks who pulled their students away from the public school system, but in large part, everyone essentially ended up was staying in the public schools. And so you had the ability to really do some dramatic things and say, yeah, we hear all this complaint, but ultimately 90+% of the students in the public schools system are going to remain in the public school system, and you can do some desegregation efforts. The reason I mention that is now that has changed pretty dramatically in a state like North Carolina, where you now have charter schools with no limit on the number of charter schools that you can have in the state, where you have now vouchers really gaining a real stronghold in North Carolina that also takes families and students away from the public school system. And you have an increasing number of families that are choosing to homeschool their children as well. And so that context becomes important when you talk about how do you figure out how you're going to do something, maybe if you want to begin to turn that dial back around, is the context has changed such that many school districts are now majority students of color, and like in Guilford County schools, white population now makes up a little over a third, where it used to be 60 to 70% of the student body. Charlotte-Mecklenburg may be actually now under 30% white. And so the context has changed when you try to figure out how you might try to move some things forward around desegregating schools again.
Mr. Watson, you're in an advocacy role. What's sort of the thinking on what's out there now to kind of push back against this?
So first off, I'm a product of Guilford County Schools. Me and Mr. Green were talking about that. I was essentially a part of a program that allowed me to go to a school that was outside of my district. However, my sister, who was about 10 years older than me, wasn't, and she went to an all-black school and had different issues and obstacles. But when we talk about the diversity of schools, we also should be talking about the makeup of the classrooms that we have in our schools, because we might have an integrated school, but you might be the only black person in your class and might not ever see black kids until you go, to a sport or something. So I think it's important that we mention that. In terms of the charter school movement and just generally, I guess, the climate that's out there right now, I think a big concern that I have is the proliferation of charter schools that don't have to be held accountable like public schools do. I think that you can kind of cook the books when you're able to hide certain statistics and data that are traditionally always being kept and held by public schools. So that's a big concern for me. I understand why some people feel the need for charter schools, but I think that if we're going to have them, and it seems like we're going to be going that way, considering some of the recent developments here, we need to make sure that they're held accountable, just like public schools are.
Well, let's move on a little bit on that note, and maybe you could talk a little bit about this concept of the achievement gap, which you're talking about accountability and No Child Left Behind, which was the law until last year at the federal level, demanded from schools that data be published about, that tests be given, standardized tests be given, and the data be published in what was known as a disaggregated fashion. So instead of saying our whole school has 70% of the kids at grade level, now they have to report out different small groups of children, or all their groups of children, their racial groups, their socioeconomic groups, their math and English and boys and girls and all of that. And as a result of that publication, we now sort of have named this thing the achievement gap, because those reports have resulted in sort of this perceived gap on academics. And so how do you see that playing out in the schools and with the current policies? We're moving from a federal back to putting things more at the state level, and how do you think that's going to affect this sort of whole achievement gap issue?
I'm definitely going to let Mr. Green speak to this once I finish. But I'd like to say that I think I'm concerned about it. I do think that we're going to have to see state and local organizations kind of take command and control of data that's available and accessible and gathering it and making it public, because if anybody's paying attention to policies that are being pushed right now at the federal level, there are attempts being made to bury data. I don't know why you would want to bury certain data. I guess I could think of a few reasons why, but I think that we have to make sure that someone is a good steward of that data and that information. So I think that if it's not going to be done at the federal level, we have to see more organizations and state agencies kind of take that over.
Yeah, so first of all, just so you know where I stand on, I don't like to use the term achievement gap. And so, because implicit in there is a sense that there is someone who is less than someone else. Well, in no regard am I going to say that one child is less than another child. And so I don't like to use those terms. I recognize that that is the way that it's sort of the way that people talk. And it is, sort of common to use those terminologies. But in my mind, we're all trying to hit a particular standard and, trying to have all students try to hit a particular standard. And so where are different students in trying to hit that standard at that particular time? Like, for example, so it wouldn't be known unless I just tell you right now that because African American males, as I said earlier, are generally seen as being at the bottom of everything that they should be at the middle, top, et cetera, all throughout. But if I were to share with you that African American males actually graduate at a higher rate than white males in Guilford County schools, that would be a shocker. Because most people would not ever think of that as being actually accurate or true. Because they have put in their minds, when you talk about achievement gaps, African American males are going to be at the bottom, they're going to stay there. And so you just need to understand at the outset, I don't like this terminology around achievement gap. What is particularly important, though, about the achievement gap discussion is the focus on subgroups of students. And why aren't certain students performing to hit that standard and go beyond that standard? And then what are we going to do to make that happen? Because as I've always said, internally to our organization in Guilford County Schools and externally to the broader community, it's not the children. The children are marvelous, intelligent, wonderful individuals. They are capable of doing the work. And so what is it that we're doing or not doing as adults that are allowing certain kids to not hit the standard that we've set out there? And so I would suggest to you that part of what we have done is we've not affirmatively identified that we come into these situations with a bias against certain groups of people. I'm not calling anyone a racist. Far from it, because all of us come in with biases. But the reality is those biases then play out in a systematic way that allows for the results that we see in our schools. And so these marvelous, intelligent students are almost from before they even walk in the door, are seen as less than and not capable of. And then we proceed as adults to treat them that way. And so if we're going to do something about having more students meet those standards, then I think it's going to be about the adults and what we do to try to have that occur. It's going to be about funding issues. It's going to be about who we put before our young people on a daily basis and what sort of tools they have in their toolbox. How do we try to help with their implicit biases as they're working with certain groups of students to overcome some of those issues?
Thank you. I know, Ms. Counts-Scoggins, you worked in early childhood, so that area before they even got to school. So what were you doing to try to avoid this so-called achievement gap?
One of the things that we found and which we know is that a lot of homes of children that are what I call children of poverty, because the agencies that I worked with, a lot of the preschool programs that they had, of course operating in Charlotte, had these children enrolled in their programs. But one of the things we found that in an early age, a lot of those children didn't have any books in the home. So we know that literacy is so very, very important. So one of the things that we tried to do is to have programs that would be available to families. No, they couldn't buy books. They could go to the library, but that's one of the things that we were trying to teach parents, to take the opportunity to go to the library. But the other part of it was we had books available to them, also in English as well as Spanish, that the kids could take home, and we called it a book cuddling opportunity, where children could sit on their parents' laps and parents could read to their children. So we felt that that was a start in terms of at least working with literacy. But the other part of it is that when I would go into programs, I was trying to make sure that those teachers that were working with those children understood cultural competency. Everybody is not the same. So therefore, as a result of that, then when you decide what you're going to teach and how you're going to teach it, you cannot teach every child the same way. So that was one of the big focuses that I had in terms of doing that. And I wanted to go back when you were talking about the charter schools in Charlotte, what has happened, the same thing that has happened. But what we have found in Charlotte, the charter schools are now segregated. And a lot of that has come as a result of where these schools are built. Because a lot of what's happening around Charlotte in terms of schools, it has to do because it's a school assignment, it's districting. And so therefore what happens is that in the way the lines are drawn, they're drawn around housing patterns. And so therefore a lot of the charter schools are in neighborhoods where we would see primarily white neighborhoods. But so what happens in those schools are also predominantly white, but what happens is the schools that have come up in the sort of the urban area, those schools are predominantly black because that's where they surround the downtown area of Charlotte. So it's not just the public schools we are seeing be segregated again, but we're also seeing the charter schools as well.
And just going back to accountability, when you talk about a charter school and what they're required to provide, are they required to provide a lunch for a student? And who is that going to most directly, harm and hurt the most? Are they required to provide buses to access their school? Those are questions that we need to be thinking about when we're talking about charter schools, because if we're not thinking about those things, and we're talking about neighborhood schools, and that looks like a pretty similar thing to something else, I think, pre-1954 and pre-Brown.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the school-to-prison pipeline, and then I'm going to like to open it up for questions, and we'll start with you, Mr. Watson. I know that's one of your big areas, and maybe you could just sort of talk about how does that fit in with the Black Lives Movement, the sort of, that narrative and ways that we're trying to break that narrative?
So, I think about Black Lives Matter and the movement as basically saying that everybody should be entitled to an equal opportunity to kind of live life without, oppression and systematic racism kind of being at the forefront of everything that you happen to see. If you can't get behind children and how the school-to-prison pipeline directly relates to that, then I don't think you're going to understand the movement at all, because children are the most, I guess the most likely people to be kind of stepped on and overlooked. And I think we have a responsibility to advocate for them as we advocate for ourselves as adults. Of course, the juvenile system and the intra-school discipline intersectionality point, you get caught in the juvenile system and you basically are subject to really experience more mistreatment. You're also more likely to go into the adult system. And in North Carolina, again, I got to stress this, you're not just talking about going to juvenile court if you're in school and get in trouble. You're going to the adult courts, you're going to adult jails for things that might happen and occur in school, and that back when I was even coming up, used to be treated and handled by principals and administrators. So we have to really think about what we're doing and how we're criminalizing our young people in North Carolina and New York by automatically treating the 16, 17-year-olds as adults. The school-to-prison pipeline generally starts with academic failure, right? We see people not necessarily meeting expectations and not performing to tests. And then they move on into behavior issues, right? From there, they are subject to discipline, and that means time outside of the classroom. When you're losing time in a classroom, you're really having to kind of play catch up whenever you get back in. You're missing instruction time, you're missing the opportunity to be ready for whatever it is that's going to happen, and what you need to be prepared for in your exams. And then, of course, from that discipline also comes the court involvement. Almost half of all juvenile court referrals in North Carolina come from schools. So it doesn't stop when a student turns 16. They end up going to adult criminal court. So I think that's something that we really need to be mindful of. And then statewide, only 27% of black students are college and career ready. So while we might have black students graduating, we need to be mindful of how ready they are to go into the next step, to go into college or the workforce. And you contrast that with, in the state, 60% of white students being college and career ready. That's the so-called achievement gap that I also don't like the term, but that's what we're talking about.
Anybody want to add anything on the school prison pipeline before I open it up to the audience?
I'm happy to open it up.
All right. All right. We got the rest of the time for you all to ask the panelists questions, things feeding off what we've heard, or other things that you're interested in. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to whether it's possible, hopeless, to find